B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. Thanks for clicking. It's Tuesday, March 6, 2018. And in a surprising about-face, Kim Jong-un turns on a dime faster than the Trump guy after hosting a delegation of 10 South Koreans over dinner in Pyongyang. And what will Trump do if his bully tactics are defused? And a question arises. Is Kim Jong-un arguably more rational, more stable, we'll leave the genius stuff out of it, than our President 45? Because he has shown himself to be crafty, a skilled negotiator, up against the guy who wrote The Art of the Deal and brags about what a great deal maker he is. So Kim Jong-un made quite a few shocking statements. He said he's willing to negotiate with the United States on abandoning his nuclear weapons. And just yesterday, I reported to you that North Korea said they would only engage in talks without preconditions, and they had preconditions of their own, including that the nuclear and missiles are off the table. So according to one of the South Koreans who attended this meeting, the North Korean side clearly stated its willingness to denuclearize. It made it clear that it would have no reason to keep nuclear weapons if the military threat to the North was eliminated and its security guaranteed. This would be the first time that Kim has indicated his government is willing to discuss relinquishing nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees from the United States. In the statement from the government of South Korea, the North expressed its willingness to hold a heartfelt dialogue with the U.S. on the issues of denuclearization and normalizing relations with the United States. It made clear that while dialogue is continuing, it will not attempt any strategic provocations, such as nuclear and ballistic missile tests. The South Korean statement said that the two nations would begin working-level discussions to prepare for a summit to be held in the Peace House on the 38th parallel in Panmunjom. The countries will also install for the first time a hotline by which the leaders can talk on the phone directly. I mean, why don't they just trade Samsungs? Who needs a landline anymore? So this is disarming. No question about it. And it throws Trump off balance, which is what he loves to do to everybody else. He, of course, tweeted, "Possible progress being made in talks with North Korea for the first time in many years. A serious efforts being made by all parties concerned. The world is watching and waiting. Maybe false hope, but the U.S. is ready to go hard in either direction." Well, it may be false hope. And we can't rely simply on the statements of Kim Jong-un. But it's a start. And it'll be very interesting to see where this goes and if the U.S. can stand down from the cliff that Trump has taken us out on. The brinksmanship with North Korea, elevating them to the level of a world power. That was his biggest blunder. Meanwhile, the Russiagate scandal continues to obsess many Americans, the corporate media, and the fine folks at MSDNC. Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview. It runs a little longer than an hour, and it's worth every minute. Scott Ritter, who was a UN weapons inspector, I interviewed him many times during the Bush administration, and we recalled together that we even were on stage together here in California for an event in about 2006. And I've always found Scott Ritter to be credible. He went into Iraq and said, "Nope, there aren't any WMDs here. And if Saddam has chemical weapons, they're weak and expired." And he was right. And I didn't know this, but Scott Ritter served in Russia as a Marine intelligence officer before he was assigned to the weapons inspection sector. So he knows Russian intelligence. And he wrote a brilliant piece published on February 28th at TruthDig. I'll link to it in this show file and, of course, in the show file of the interview podcast itself. But if I summarize for you briefly, what Scott Ritter has deduced is that Russia did, in fact, hack into DNC servers. But it was long before the brouhaha surfaced in 2016. And he buttresses his argument with an acknowledged anonymous source, or a series of anonymous reports that have been published by a Dutch newspaper, claiming that Dutch intelligence had penetrated Russian intelligence in Moscow, and that they were able to actually witness a cyber battle between American actors and Russian actors on the Russian server in Moscow. So the Dutch claim that as far back as October of 2014, they developed access to Russian security servers, and they were able to monitor what was going on. Now, I need to underscore that just like the whole Rachel Maddow narrative that is built on anonymous sources, and leaks and documents that we've never seen, evidence that we're told exists but we are not permitted to view it, we have to treat this Dutch report in a similar fashion. But I'm interested in really aggressively talking to people and trying to get to the truth here. Scott Ritter is skeptical, as I am, of the claim that hacked materials from the DNC were transferred to WikiLeaks and then weaponized and released as part of the 2016 campaign. And it gets a little complicated because you have to make a distinction between APT-29, Advanced Persistent Threat 29, and APT-28. And in this excerpt, Scott Ritter explains.
We don't know what Robert Mueller's doing. We don't have access to the totality of his information.
Well, there are leaks coming out, but yes.
Right. But you know, he did put out an indictment against 13 Russians and 3 Russian entities. That indictment's a joke.
Yes, it is.
That indictment is not based upon secret intelligence information. That indictment is almost word for word taken from Russian and American media sources that have been following this story since 2014. The only thing that was in there that could possibly be considered, law enforcement was the confession by this idiot in California who sells PayPal accounts using stolen identities.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But even that, without the specifics, was said in several articles that they were using PayPal accounts to make these payments. So nothing in that indictment was secret. Nothing in that indictment is intelligence or law enforcement sensitive information. It's a regurgitation of publicly available data, but written in a way to paint a picture that is not the truth. And that's the point I want to make here. Mueller's game has been exposed. That indictment was written in a way to paint a picture that is not the truth. And why is this dangerous? Because they're now talking in the next several weeks that Mueller's going to put out an indictment about WikiLeaks. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to tell you right now that I predict that he's going to use the APT-29 attribution against Russia and link it to APT-28 data theft, because it's the APT-28 data, or at least the data that's been linked to APT-28 that ended up with WikiLeaks. None of the data that APT-29 took ended up in WikiLeaks. None of it. They were done in early April. They were out of the system before CrowdStrike got there. So this is all APT-28, but it's important to note that when we talk about, saying Russia did it, Russia intelligence went in and gathered information. They collected intelligence. That's what they do. That's what we do. That's what intelligence services do. But did Russian intelligence weaponize stolen emails for political purposes? And I think the answer is no, they did not.
As you heard, Scott Ritter believes that Bob Mueller's indictment of the 13 Russians with the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg is, he didn't say bullshit, but I will, and that he is highly skeptical of claims that WikiLeaks got this information from Russian agents. And He also openly speculates about Seth Rich, and I do too. We don't know why he died, and we do know that he had attempted to set up a Dropbox account and transfer some information to WikiLeaks. So it's a fascinating discussion, and Scott Ritter, as a former weapons expert, also talks about Putin's speech on March 1st, and that the U.S. has known about the Russian efforts to develop its advanced category of weapons since 2007, and that we have ignored it and tried to bluff our way through it. So it's a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank our listener in Switzerland, Olivier de Merlot, it's Mirleau, Mirleau, who sent me an email yesterday after he heard my coverage of Scott Ritter's article last week and said, well, why don't you have Scott on? So I did, and I'm glad I did. Thank you, Olivier. Also on the Russiagate front, Kevin Gosztola exposes Republican operators who are trying to mislead the American public into thinking that there are Russian bots behind everything these days, and in particular that Russian bots have been active in social media trying to incite pipeline protests in the United States. And Gosztola does a little math to show that the impact of the alleged Russian Twitter bots is just grossly overstated, and that there are plenty of domestic actors who oppose fracking, who oppose pipelines. And it was Hillary Clinton back in 2014 who kind of began this meme. She accused phony environmental groups that she believes are funded by the Russians of being responsible for the opposition to oil pipelines and natural gas fracking. And now Lamar Smith, the chairman of a House committee, he's a Texas congressman, a Republican, he's echoing the same line. These poor environmentalists are being used and manipulated by Russians. How could they oppose fracking? How could they be against pipelines? No American would do that. It's just ridiculous. And we have left touch with reality. And part of that is based on media malpractice. My friend Norman Solomon, who wrote the book about manipulation, about the way we are propagandized into war, well, he wrote a piece that's at Consortium News today. More than 7 weeks after a devastating report from the media watch group FAIR, top executives and primetime anchors at MSNBC still refuse to discuss how the network's obsession with Russia has thrown minimal journalistic standards out the window. And Solomon recaps that FAIR found that the leading liberal cable network did not run a single segment devoted specifically to the war in Yemen during the entire second half of 2017. And during that period, they ran nearly 5,000% more segments that mentioned Russia than segments that even mentioned Yemen. And that's just one yardstick that they use. Solomon continues, the programming on MSNBC follows a thin blue party line, breathlessly conforming to Democratic leaders' refrains about Russia as a mortal threat to American democracy and freedom across the globe. But hey, MSNBC's ratings have climbed upward during its monochrome reporting, so why worry about whether coverage is neglecting dozens of other crucial stories? Or why worry if the anti-Russia drumbeat is worsening the risks of a global conflagration? And he calls out Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes in particular, and the producers and other handlers who work with those two shows. And he writes, as the cable news network most trusted by Democrats as a liberal beacon, MSNBC plays a special role in fueling rage among progressive-minded viewers toward Russia's, quote, attack on our democracy. So I think it's a good piece. He also quotes our friend, the late Robert Perry. The U.S. media's approach to Russia is now virtually 100% propaganda. Does any sentient human being read the Times or the Washington Post coverage of Russia and think that he or she is getting a neutral or unbiased treatment of the facts? Well, it's APAC week in Washington. We had the photo op of the two most investigated world leaders, Trump and Netanyahu, in the Oval yesterday. And Bibi was back at APAC with his thundering Prince of Darkness Act, warning that darkness is descending as Iran expands its sphere of influence in the Middle East. The force behind so much that is bad is this radical tyranny in Tehran. If I have a message for you today, it's a very simple one. We must stop Iran. We will stop Iran. He told AIPAC he had warned against the Iran nuclear deal. In fact, he came here and interfered in our domestic processes and substituted the interests of the state of Israel for those of the United States. That's my opinion. Yes, he did warn against it, and he tried to scuttle it. He even was using underhanded tactics that led the Obama administration to tap the phones of members of Congress to see what Israel was doing in order to sway their vote over the Iran nuclear deal. So go away, Bibi. Go back and face the music in Israel. And I hope they find you guilty and take you out of office. Speaking of Iran, our friend Gareth Porter published a piece also at Consortium News where he exposes and builds on his previous work that Iran didn't really have a nuclear weapons program. They were enriching uranium, and they were maintaining a kind of ambiguity because they saw that when Saddam disarmed and when Gaddafi disarmed and pledged not to pursue nuclear weapons, that they were dead not too long after that. And so Porter talks about Operation Merlin, and he goes through the shifts in U.S. intelligence assessments about Iran and how key language was manipulated back in 1999 and 2000 to create the impression that the intelligence community firmly believed that Iran was working to develop nuclear weapons when that is not the case. There was deep division in our intelligence community about that. And the political side won with the help of Dick Cheney and others. They turned Iran into this nuclear threat. And Netanyahu still wants to use it to try to take down the Ayatollah. Porter concludes his article, Operation Merlin is the perfect example of powerful bureaucratic interests running amok and creating the intelligence necessary to justify their operations. And the net result is that CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling was unjustly imprisoned, that the United States has gone down a path of Iran policy that poses serious and unnecessary threats to American society. Every day I pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Paul Elsesser, who drops a check on the first of every month. And here's our $10 club. Casey Condon, Julie Dupree, Sandra Fish, they all kick in a 10 spot every month, and I really appreciate it. I invite you to join them. I need your help to keep this whole operation going. In fact, I'm working on my taxes for 2017, and I ran the numbers, and I'm shockingly disappointed at how much of a drop in subscriber revenue we saw last year. So if you value the work I do, if you like hearing the provocative analysis and the skeptical reporting that I deliver on a daily basis, please step up and support me at peterbcollins.com. You click menu, pull it down, click Become a Subscriber. It gets you to the sign-up page where you've got options. Well, the dance has begun. Today, the Senate voted 67-32. That means that over a dozen Democrats supported the move to close debate, actually to close the process and start a debate on a devastating bill called the Crapo bill. I call it Crapo. Mike Crapo is the senator who wrote it, and it is a huge hit on Dodd-Frank. Elizabeth Warren, leading contender here to fight on this. There's Democratic and Republican support because the lobbyists have been pushing since the first day Dodd-Frank passed to weaken the regulations on these giant banks. People in this building may forget the devastating impact of the financial crisis 10 years ago, but the American people have not forgotten. Millions of people lost their homes, millions lost their jobs, millions lost their savings, and they do not want to turn loose the big banks again. Bernie Sanders, quote, Now is not the time to deregulate banks that have more than $3.5 trillion in assets and lay the groundwork for another massive financial collapse. Now is the time to take on the greed and power of Wall Street and break up the largest financial institutions in the country. But they're not going to listen to Bernie. It is the self-interest of people like John Tester of Montana, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, that clown Donnelly, Joe Donnelly in Indiana. These are people who fear that if they take on Wall Street, they won't have the money to run their campaigns and try to hold on to their Senate seats. And this self-interest substituted for the public interest is a defining virus of this era. And at The Intercept, David Dayen, who does a great job covering financial crimes, he notes that the Congressional Budget Office published an estimate of the cost of this bill and that it would be about $671 million over a 10-year period because of the increased possibility of bank failures. And it's interesting, in a story about this from The Guardian, they only published this kind of bland quote from the CBO. The estimate of the bill's budgetary effect is subject to considerable uncertainty, in part because it depends on the probability in any year that a systemically important financial institution will fail, or that there will be a financial crisis. But when you look at the full quote, they don't equivocate in the same manner. So this is a victory for the Citibank lobbyists, and the banks that were too big to fail in 2008 will have even less scrutiny going forward. I recommend an op-ed in the Times today by Mike Conzal. I don't know the guy. He's at the Roosevelt Institute. And the headline reads, "Why are Democrats helping Trump dismantle Dodd-Frank?" And he details this crappy bill. Oh, and let's add Claire McCaskill of Missouri to the Democratic sellouts. And he busts through the same lie that I exposed yesterday, that this provides much-needed relief for community banks and credit unions. But he says that view is mistaken. No, it's a lie. This bill goes far beyond the health of community banks and credit unions. It removes protections for 25 of the top 38 banks. It weakens regulation of the biggest players, encourages them to manipulate regulations for their benefit, and it saps consumer protection. So we went off a cliff 10 years ago. And now, just like, who were those women who drove a convertible off a cliff? My movie memory is too weak. Anyway, you know what I mean. And it's Democrats who are enabling this. They could block this in the Senate, but they don't want to, because they want the campaign cash and because they identify more with Wall Street than they do with the base of the Democratic Party. And this is hardly news, but it's confirmation. In the business section of the Washington Post today, examples of how Trump is systematically backing off consumer protections and that it delights corporations. They talk about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Last year, they were doing 3 to 5 actions a month. This year, it's 0. The Labor Department has delayed full implementation of a rule requiring financial advisors to act in their clients' best interest. I think that's a Treasury Department rule, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to check that out. And the Department of Education has withdrawn Obama-era regulations meant to strengthen protections for student borrowers. Those are just 3 examples of dozens. The opioid crisis continues to spin out of control in this country. New figures from the last reporting period, which is July of 16 to July of 17, showed that opioid overdoses increased by 30%. Up to 142,000 overdoses in U.S. hospital emergency departments during that time period. In 2016, the calendar year, illicit and prescription drug overdoses killed 64,000 people, the highest overdose death rates ever recorded in the United States. Wisconsin, overdose increases 109%, Delaware 105%, Pennsylvania 81%. And this is a heavy load for a judge in Cleveland, federal judge Dan Aaron Polster. They have dropped 400 federal lawsuits brought by cities, counties, tribes related to opioids. The defendants are the manufacturers, the distributors, and the pharmacy chains that sold them to the end users. And Judge Polster is a no-nonsense guy. He said, look, this is not going to be a years-long process where, you just keep demanding more discovery and delay Judgment Day. At the very beginning of this case in January, he told the lawyers to prepare for settlement discussions immediately. And to heighten the urgency, he noted at one point 150 Americans are going to die today, just today, while we're talking about this. So this judge has experience in the what's called multi-district litigation, and he appears to be very determined to come up with a meaningful settlement. And I hope he does, and I hope he really hammers all three sectors, the makers, the distributors, and the retailers. They knew what they were doing when they addicted millions of people. And now we're cutting them off and telling them, well, there's heroin on the street. Just be careful and try not to take fentanyl, okay? I mean, it's really so obscene that words fail me. They're still working on prosecuting some of the protesters who were out on the streets of Washington, D.C. during Trump's inauguration in 2017. And there are 59 people still facing criminal charges. 129 had the charges dropped. And the first 6 people who went to trial were all acquitted. So the government is going deeper. They're going to present a woman whose fake name is Julie McMahon. She's going to testify that she was a covert infiltrator and that they used black bloc techniques. Now, from the description here in this BuzzFeed article, it appears that she is going to deliver some pretty speculative testimony based on her infiltration of black bloc groups in New York in the past. So it does show that there were undercover operatives with the protesters, and we'll have to see what ultimately is exposed in this case. I kind of feel sorry for the mayor of Nashville, Megan Barry. One of her sons died of a drug overdose related to opioids. Then she got involved in an affair with her bodyguard, the chief of security for her detail in the mayor's office. She admitted that. And it appears there's a double standard here. Because we have many male politicians who have admitted to affairs and kept their jobs. Not all, but some. There's one in the White House who hasn't admitted anything, but he's in deep denial. At any rate, Megan Barry basically was caught up because her bodyguard went with her on a number of trips that were paid for by Nashville taxpayers. And because they were having an illicit, adulterous affair, this somehow becomes a crime. Well, it depends on how these expenses were reported, and I'm sorry to see her dragged down in this manner. Congratulations to the teachers in West Virginia. They held out for almost 2 weeks, refusing to go back into the classroom. And the Republican-controlled Senate, House, and governorship, they tried to feed him some nice words and say, yeah, just go back to work. And the teachers said, no, we want a firm agreement. And I'm disappointed only that they only got a 5% raise. They are the poorest paid teachers, or among the poorest paid in the country. Their health care costs have been escalating, and many of them can't afford to continue teaching. So I applaud these teachers. They don't have a labor contract with the state. They're among the lowest paid in the nation. They haven't had an across-the-board raise in 4 years. I understand Oklahoma will be the next scene of a teacher walkout, and I hope you get a fair settlement. Here in California, we are on the cutting edge of the new technology, driverless cars. The state has approved, starting in early April, that test cars can operate without somebody behind the wheel. And there is a backlash. I'm a little surprised. But there is a kind of road rage breaking out against the driverless cars. On the 10th of January here in San Francisco, a pedestrian ran across the street to confront a GM Cruise autonomous vehicle that was waiting for people to cross the road. The pedestrian was shouting at the car, then struck the left side of the Cruise bumper and hatch with his entire body, and a left taillight was damaged. In a separate incident just a few blocks away and a couple of weeks later, a taxi driver in San Francisco exited his car, approached a GM Cruise vehicle, and slapped the front passenger window. Yes, some people resist technological advance in a very overt way. And finally, today we say farewell and happy trails to Russ Solomon. I only met the man once, but he was the founder of the Tower Records chain, and I shopped in his stores here in California. I remember when they expanded, and I went into their big store in London at Piccadilly. And, of course, the retail record business crashed with downloads and the shift in how people get their music. And Russ Solomon went out the way any rocker would want to. He was sipping bourbon, watching the Academy Awards Sunday night, when his heart stopped. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. We give it away free. You're free to share it with anybody, and it's on YouTube. Go there and click subscribe, will you?
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.